Okay, everyone. So, welcome back to another series episode of Conversations on Race and Police, brought to you by the CSUSB File Library with your student co-host. I'm Marlo Brooks here. We also have Cameron and Yvette. You guys are muted. I'm not sure if that's a tech problem.
No, it's not a tech problem. What's going on,
Okay.
everybody? My name is Kameron Pyant. I'm a fourth-year English major, and I just pretty much appreciate that we're continuing the conversation that's heavily needed right now.
All right. And we have
Okay, I
Yvette.
got my mic,
There we
sorry.
are.
Hi, I'm Yvette. I'm majoring in communications and minoring in environmental studies. And thank you all for coming back to the conversation.
All right, and again, I'm Marlo Brooks. I am a senior studying English in the College of Arts and Letters here at California State University of San Bernardino. And again, welcome you all back to another series, another episode on race, on conversations on race and policing. So today, how we like to start our show is we always like to give a land acknowledgement. We always like to give a land acknowledgement. Which is a formal statement that recognizes and respects the indigenous people and our relationships between indigenous people and the ancestral territories. So those of you who don't know, CSUSB does sit on indigenous land. So we always like to pay our respects to that land as we start our show. So we recognize that California State University of San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the CSUSB community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationships to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold CSUSB more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. So thank you. So another new segue into our show is we will start announcing recent events that's happened in the world. Some things that people may not know or may do know, and it may add to more Q&A on the second half of the show. So I'm going to turn things over to my co-host Yvette as she introduces our new segment.
Okay, so as Marlo said, we're going to be trying to bring awareness to the different outcomes that have arose because of the worldwide efforts towards social justice for everyone. So today, I wanted to bring to you guys' attention a couple of stories. So Elijah McClain was an Aurora County resident, and he was wrongfully accosted by police for wearing a mask. He wore this mask to accommodate his anemia in cold weather. He later died in hospital after further negligent treatment. This past week, 3 officers were fired and 1 resigned after an image of the officers displaying mockery at McClain's memorial was sent around in a group chat. Amongst the disgraced officers was Jason Rosenblatt. Rosenblatt was directly involved with the unjust encounter which led to McClain's death. You may be aware of a 2011 study which gathered that 21% of transgender women and 10% of transgender men have been incarcerated. You may also be aware of a 2015 comprehensive study by which found Black transgender persons are more likely to be physically abused by police than any other, and Latinx transgender persons are most likely to be sexually assaulted by police. This past week, community members marched against policing and laws intended to streamline systemic racism and gender discrimination as such is the fittingly named Walking Wild Trans Ban, which has accommodated the growing population of wrongfully jailed and battered trans people of color. Communities have organized to lobby against this practice and pressure New York legislators to pass Assembly Bill 654 and Senate Bill 2253, which would repeal New York State's loitering for the purpose of prostitution law, a caveat which has been used several times in court against faultless individuals from the transgender community. And I'll also include the link if you want to follow up with that.
Great, thank you, Yvette. And would you do us the honor by introducing our first guest today?
So our first guest today is Fran Polletta, professor of sociology at UCI. So Fran, if you want to go ahead and let us all know what you got to say.
Thank you, Yvette. Thank you to the hosts and the organizers for these conversations. I've already watched one and learned a lot. And so I'm really grateful for you doing this and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about activism. I wrote a book now almost 20 years ago about movement organizations that try to operate as radical democracies, that are decentralized rather than centralized, that try to make decisions with all members involved, that operate from the bottom up. And I focused on an organization that some of you may have heard of called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was an organization that operated in the South in the early 1960s. It was a Black radical organization that built political power among Black residents of Mississippi, Southwest Georgia, and Alabama. And it was the organization that first introduced the term Black Power. At the time I began writing the book, sociologists and sociologists who studied social movements tended to believe that organizations that tried to operate radically democratically, that tried to make decisions by consensus, that were bottom up rather than top down, were inefficient and ineffective. And my study of SNCC led me to believe that that wasn't the case. What I'm struck by now when I look at protests 20 years later is how much of what SNCC workers were really pioneering has become sort of part of the activist DNA of progressive activists. So I'm struck by a lot of activist organizations, certainly by Black Lives Matter, at the ways in which activists now try to capitalize on local initiative, right, with national organizations supporting local movements, but not directing them. I'm struck by the emphasis on what are called now leader-full organizations, in which there's really an attempt to build leaders from within communities. There's an assumption that just inviting people to participate in movement decision-making is often not enough to counter subtle ways in which privilege operates. And I think activists now are really conscious of that. So I think because activists have learned from prior generations of activists, we really see ways in which grassroots organizing, radically democratic organizing is kind of taken for granted among activists today. And so then I thought, well, is there anything that we can still learn from the movements of the 1960s? Is there anything that we can still learn in particular from student activism against racial injustice of the kind that SNCC activists were involved in? And I think there are kind of three lessons that I was thinking about in preparation for this panel, kind of three things that I think we can take from those earlier movements that might be relevant to people now, to students now who are involved or who want to become involved in activism. The first lesson is that if you see an injustice and you want to mobilize around it, whatever that injustice is, know that there are probably already people in your community who have been working on that issue, sometimes under the radar, but for a long time, right? I think that's the single most important insight that comes out of the study of social movements, is that movements never come out of nowhere, right? There are always activists who have been working locally, who've been working for a long time to fight those issues. So Bob Moses was a math teacher in New York City in 1960. He heard about the student sit-ins that were going on around the South, in which Black students were sitting in at segregated lunch counters, and he wanted to do something to help. So he traveled down to Atlanta, Georgia, and then to Mississippi. And in rural Mississippi, he met a man named Amzie Moore, who doesn't appear much in the history books, the histories of the civil rights movement. But Amzie Moore had been fighting against Black disenfranchisement since the 1940s. And he had a plan. He said to Moses, what I want to do is I want to bring these Black students who are sitting in to rural Mississippi, to one of the most repressive areas of the Deep South. And I want to get them helping people to train to register to vote. I want to build a voter registration movement in the Black Belt, in the most repressive area of the South. And that's what Moses and Moore did. Moses went to SNCC and he convinced people in SNCC that they should launch a voter registration campaign. And they did, and launched one of the kind of most creative, effective periods of political organizing, I think, in this country. Now, it's important to note that the SNCC activists weren't just foot soldiers in Amzie Moore's army, right? They really brought something to the table. They were smart, they were courageous. At their best, they knew how to work with local Black leaders where they could and work around them where they couldn't. But I think it was that synergy of student activists working with people who knew the terrain, who knew what they were up against, that made that movement so effective. And so I think the first lesson that we can learn is, start your own movement, but get in touch with the people who are already there, who are already in the trenches. Either join them, work with them, learn from them. And I think I'm looking forward to hearing from Chache, because he's in the NAACP, and I think he'll have things to say about this. The second lesson is that it is really hard to keep a movement going, and yet that is essential, right? You start a campus organization, you have a dozen people come to the first meeting, 24 come to the second meeting, 100 people come to the protest, and you really are on fire, you're on your way. And then it's finals time, and there are only 6 people at the meeting. And then you have a protest, and it's a rainy day, and not many people show up. This is something that generations of activists have struggled with. How do you keep the momentum going? And I think the sort of lesson I get from studying the Southern Civil Rights Movement is 2 answers. One, that being a leaderful organization or a leaderful movement means not only sharing power, it also means training people to take over leadership, right? So that when you burn out, because you will burn out, someone else can take your place. And I think that has been a really crucial insight of the movement, that idea that you're always training people to take over. And then I think the second lesson in that respect that comes out of the civil rights movement is the importance of fighting locally while knowing that you're part of a broader and even national movement, right? So the people in SNCC who were working in rural areas of Mississippi and Southwest Georgia were sometimes, the only organizer in the community. And they were working on very local issues, but they felt that they were part of a national movement. And that gave them the kind of strength they needed to keep on keeping on. What's so exciting to me about the protests that we've been seeing since George Floyd's death, and to some extent before, is that they're both local and national. And I think that's essential to making change, but it's also essential to sustaining activists who are in the movement. The third lesson that comes from me out of studying SNCC and studying the civil rights movement is one that I'm not going to say very well. And I'm going to say it bluntly, and then I'm going to try to clarify. So this lesson is for white allies. This lesson is for white people in the movement. And it's that if you feel anguished by the death of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and all the other people, share your anguish with your white friends before you share it with your Black friends. A friend of mine said that she had joked with a group of Black professional women, of which she's a member, that she'd been getting a lot of emails from white women who she barely knew offering their support. And she joked with the other women in the group, well, you know, should I ask if they'll pick up my groceries? She was joking, but I think the awkwardness to which she was referring was this belief on the part of these white women contacting her. They wanted to offer her support, but they also wanted to be recognized as one of the good white people. I think that's a tendency that a lot of us have. We want to be redeemed. We want Black people to tell us we're one of the good ones. I remembered recently that when I was interviewing SNCC workers, so I interviewed them, you know, decades after the 1960s, SNCC had been an interracial organization. There were some very valued white members of the organization early on who had suffered the harassment and violence that Black members had. But at a certain point in 1965 and 1966, SNCC members, Black SNCC staffers, decided that it should be a Black organization. They asked the white staffers to leave. They asked them to go and organize in white communities. And when I interviewed the white SNCC staffers decades later, they were still bereft. They were still distraught. And it's only now that I begin to realize why. I couldn't understand then. Why were they so upset? I think I can understand now. I think it was that the white SNCC staffers saw racism for the first time in a way that most white people don't. And once they had seen that racism, they wanted to be part of a community. They wanted to be part of a safe space where they felt that they could be one of the good white people. Black staffers didn't have that privilege. And I think the lesson that I take from it is that white people do have to do the hard work of organizing in white communities. We do have to do the hard work of talking to our family members who are Trump supporters, right? Even if that work is difficult, if we think we have the slimmest chance of changing their minds. So the third lesson that I take from thinking about then in the context of now for white allies is join the movement, right? Interracial organizations are great, but think about being useful, making the fight your fight, not just to get Girl Scout points from Black people for having your heart in the right place. And then talk to those white people who disagree with you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Polletta. A lot of the points that you made, I was just taking a couple notes down. In terms of SNCC and everything like that, I believe like all of the different lessons that you were referring to, like we are pretty much living just exactly like what was being said. Like in terms of organizing different things, I know that there are a lot of different petitions going around trying to mandate a lot of different things that people will believe to be like beneficial in our communities in terms of reforming the police department or defunding them and starting to fund these new programs in all these different neighborhoods. So I feel like that's referring to what you were speaking of. Also in terms of you saying like you will honestly get burned out, and a lot of people will get burned out from constantly, fighting and stuff like that. I feel like I've been getting caught up in so much other, work and family stuff like that. But then I'm also still seeing, my friends, pretty much just pick up exactly where I left off, or, you know, like, it's just like going back and forth in terms of who's protesting, who's taking a break, or who's in this conversation, or who's taking a break. So I've been seeing a lot of that too. And then also to your third lesson, I agree with you completely in terms of that. Like, the way I see it is, you can't speak for it in front of the people who are angry about it, and then go back home and then, you know, allow a microaggression to be said in front of you. And then it's like, you could realize it, but it's like they will never realize it. And it's like, you allow it to be said, then it's they'll think it's, you know, it's all right to be said. So it's like, when you say join the movement, I agree with you in terms of that. Like, once you're in it, you have to understand that it's a way of life and stuff like that. Like, we can't just, you know, take our skin off and all of a sudden just not be Black for a day. Like, it doesn't work that way. So it's like, in terms of supporting, like, your supporting should never stop as well, because that's pretty much the problem. Racism is taught. We all know that. So it's like, when those things aren't being spoken about, then, you know, it's just going to continue. But I'm gonna stop there. I really appreciate all the knowledge that you have given. And at this moment, I'd like to introduce Dr. Diana Johnson.
Hi, sorry. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for the invitation and for organizing as well. And I think that what I want to talk about conjoins nicely, or as a follow-up nicely, because I talk about kind of post-1960s climate strategies of activism, and I'm working on a book where I chronicle multiracial activism in the 1970s, but also in the 1980s and 90s, coming out of Seattle, Washington, but then reaching in many regions and also reaching across borders. So I'll talk a little bit more about transnational strategies and how those are effective in terms of anti-racism. So I think a lot about learning lessons in terms of, you know, thinking about when movements wane, like when there's a climate of activism, which we saw in the 1960s and early 70s, and then what happens with recession, right, in the 70s, and the rise of neoconservatism and neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s. So I talk a lot about how activists continue to persevere and how their activism changes over time and what it means, and different strategies that are still successful. So I look at Seattle and I look at multiracial activism or cross-racial community building and anti-racist work. I look specifically at Chicano, Native American, African American, and Asian American coalition building, starting in the early 1970s and then all the way up till 1999. So I'm giving just, you know, a little background on what I do, and then I'll take it more into like a contemporary context, or how I see some lessons or frameworks that I think might be really useful and are already in many senses being applied to BLM and many movements against racism and police brutality today. A couple more specifics before I move forward. So some of the different things I'll mention in terms of strategies, specifically talking today, really do stem from a couple different African-American led groups, the Black Student Union at the University of Washington, I look at a lot, and then a Black led group called the United Construction Workers Association that starts in Seattle, led by a man named Tyree Scott, but then becomes very, very multiracial. So some of what I'll talk about is thinking about, or there's a foundation of those facets of activism first. So what does multiracial activism offer in Seattle is first some of what I want to talk about. So activists in Seattle are doing a lot of organizing around the university campus, right? First, the University of Washington. So it's very, very useful for activists to work across racial lines, and also very organic in many ways at a campus, right? So this is something that we see today, and something that is very much a legacy of decades and decades of activism, because activists in Seattle, right, you also have this really white space where a lot of activists feel hindered by small demographic numbers. And so they band together, and I write about that. And then on a university campus, right, you naturally have like the Black Student Union there, you have Asian Student Coalition or Asian American Student Coalition, you have Chicano organizations like MECHA, so they're already sharing this space and then having these conversations and kind of naturally sharing also what's called the Ethnic Cultural Center at the University of Washington. So that's one kind of takeaway, is the ways that multiracial activism can be used and the ways that kind of like a university campus are an organic kind of epicenter of some of that. The multiracial activism I talk about is also very useful against policing of protest movements. So the groups I talk about, right, are demonstrating against racism on campuses. They're conjoining with skilled trade workers, construction workers who are fighting a lack of, high-paying jobs during a recession in the 1970s. And groups will be very nuanced in their approaches, right? At certain times, they will protest, primarily one community of color, but if they're policed or people are arrested, they will have allies in other communities ready with bail or processes to get people out of jail, right, to align. And so that can be, and ends up being a really successful strategy. Another thing that I think I've learned from the research I do is that activists have been grappling with this issue of focusing on one community at one time and for specific reasons, and being really focused on racial pride, cultural pride, self-determination, right? So controlling one's own community, but doing that in conjunction with promoting multiracial alliance building. So I just consistently think about these critiques that are leveraged at BLM today, right? That it's exclusionary or divisive or disparaging of other groups. And so I think when we look at the long history of protest movements, we see that activists have been grappling with this for a really long time, right? This is something that they've already negotiated. And so people who are leveraging these critiques maybe at BLM today could do very well to read and think about the frameworks, right, that other activists for decades have been doing in terms of the idea that it's very possible and very effective to do alliance building, but then to also at very specific times focus on a specific community. So that happens time and time again in Seattle. So I write about how some centers or land or where occupations take place for multiple communities, and how just multiple alliances at other times will help certain communities take over land or protest, but even when they know that protest is specifically focused on one community of color. Another thing that I want to mention that is a major takeaway, and I think has a lot of contemporary context, is the kind of international perspective or transnational work that activists in Seattle, but also all around the nation, are doing in the mid-20th century. This is clearly really relevant to BLM and to the fact that we see, right, international responses to police violence in the United States today. And so again, activists have thought about this for decades and decades. And the activists I write about in Seattle, in particular Black trade workers, are very astute in making this connection and saying that an international project, anti-racist project, is one of the most viable and effective forms of anti-racism. So we can think about activists in the 70s, borrowing ideologies, for instance, from people like Malcolm X, that I think is really powerful, where he talks about, for instance, in the 1960s, framing civil rights and Black rights as human rights instead. And he says that that's much more powerful. And he believes, for instance, that that kind of transnational piece is providing a pathway of activism where Black activists are no longer kind of, asking the government, the US government, for something that's already theirs, right? So the idea that civil rights are human rights, that's already something you have, right? And that you just should actually prosecute the US government within the United Nations, right? So go to that kind of transnational or international entity is something that a lot of activists have talked about. or advocated for, I think, in a really empowering way. There's other examples that historians write about in the 1960s in the Cold War context, for instance, of using, kind of the United States foreign policy and the fact that the US tries to be this kind of bringer of democracy, right, to the world, is saying we're this promoter of freedom around the globe. And activists then use that to their advantage over and over again, and actually really embarrass the United States into signing things like the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So a lot of that actually comes from that embarrassment, that how can the United States justify saying we're this all great superpower, we're free and democratic, when look at the hypocrisies and violence, right, that's going on within our own borders, right? So that's very powerful. And then the activists I write about kind of take some of that foundation and take it even in a different direction, which I write specifically about what is called third world solidarity activism, or something that US scholars denote as the US third world left. So in particular, Black activists in Seattle kind of lead this arm of multiracial coalition building in the work that I write. And they argue that there has to be a multi-pronged kind of anti-racist project, that it has to be transnational against imperialism, that it has to be global in terms of anti-capitalist, and then anti-racist, right? And that it has to be this, this broad picture, and that alliances can be built with other nations of color. So we would mainly not use the term, third world today. That was the term that was popular then. We would more, use the term global South today. But activists of color in Seattle, many places in the nation, are deeply inspired by like Mao in China, by socialist revolutions in places like Cuba or Mozambique in Southern Africa. And so I write about those different connections and the way that transnationalism helps activists persist, reshape, and rethink their strategies of anti-racism as the 1970s and 1980s progress. And so that's something that I think is a really potentially useful lesson to think about in terms of this broader kind of global light shining on movements here at home and on the police violence we have here at home. I want to make one more kind of connection a little bit more to the economic piece as well, or the anti-capitalist piece, and how that's even more kind of threaded together or pronounced with this transnational ideology. So the activists I have researched in Seattle, specifically the United Construction Workers Association, are very clear also on this idea of economic what they call US economic imperialism as well. So they highlight, for instance, the way racism in the United States facilitates American corporations like going over to third world nations and exploiting their labor. And then they make that connection with the fact that those jobs leaving the US has a disproportionately negative effect on Black workers and other workers of color. So they use that to then continue to catalyze this necessary movement for a global anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist project. And this fits into decades and decades really of activism among people of color, among Black Americans who have called out US empire for centuries really as being very much built upon foundations of white supremacy and racism. And so I think those conversations are really, really powerful. And that shows up again and again coming out of the Pacific Northwest, which is somewhere we tend not to think about as much, I think, in terms of activism of color. And then one final thing I'll say is the connection between some of these kind of past ideologies I've been thinking a lot about, and then more of the critiques that we see of some of the protest movements, protests against police violence today. So consistently, right, we see critiques. Even, I have friends who will say they're very supportive of BLM, but do not understand, right, the economic piece, do not understand like going into stores, right, or taking merchandise. So there's a very big connection there with activists who've already made that argument that, capitalist businesses are inherently, whether directly or indirectly, involved in racist projects, right? Whether or not, your capitalism is founded on racist ideals, whether it be at home or abroad. Businesses are engaged in forms of racism if they're gentrifying communities, or if they're, offering low wages, which often disproportionately affect communities of color. So I think making those economic connections and then connecting it back to the decades and decades of history that we have of activists of color already, having this conversation, also helps us kind of lead through some of the strategies used today, and also helps us, everyone individually, think about, kind of our complicit element in this system, and maybe our responsibility in challenging it as well. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. I always wondered that. I know a lot of times in the classroom, we do speak on how media is presented from America into the other countries, and how we're portrayed to other countries. But I always ask the question of how dare we present ourselves as this facet of freedom and equality, yet there's this huge wave of capitalism and social divide and of our country. And I always wonder how it affect people who may be seeking refuge here in the America from other countries. Are they safer where they are if they're seeing the real of how we are treated here in America? From the stigma of being free. And I always wonder that, but I'm sure we'll get more into that towards the end of the show once we get into Q&A. And I do want to remind all of our guests in the room that I see a few people raising their hand, so they may want to ask a question. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, please post them in there, and we will get through them. We will get to them throughout and at the Q&A session of the show. So thank you again, Dr. Diana Johnson, for that economic info. We needed that. But this portion of the show leads right into our next panelist, who happens to be myself, Marlo Brooks, a student at CSUSB. Again, I am a senior studying English in the College of Arts and Letters. And in the first half of our show, we've spoken on activism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and mid 20th century. And I guess it leads right into myself on early this year, I ran for city council of San Bernardino, which is the city I live in. And how did we get here? Again, I mentioned that I'm a student, and it's important for me to say that because our youth is what's being affected today. Dr. Polletta stated, stated a lot on the youthfulness and the importance of youth activism, youth leadership, youth organizing in our communities, and what it means to vote locally. So as a student at CSUSB, I was a transfer student from the community college of Barstow, California. I'm originally from Jacksonville, Florida. I moved here from Jacksonville in 2013 and started attending Barstow Community College in 2014. I graduated from there with an associate's degree in social science. And during my time there, I was able to start an organization on the campus. And the organization was called Barstow BRASS. BRASS was an acronym for Brothers Reaching Academic Success and Service. It was just something that I saw that the campus community needed. Oftentimes, and at this time, and it's probably still true to this day, the numbers are probably still the same. African-American men or minority males were not graduating from college. We can get them in school, but They weren't staying to the full course and they weren't graduating. So I created a program on the campus called Barstow Brass, which um, got got our youth and our minority males together to practice just that, getting through college together, um, finding different resources and things that can keep us in. A lot of times, men have that financial construct over their head where they have to take care of home or take care of the kids, and also school falls second to that oftentimes. So we found a way to support each other and divide resources amongst the community and the campus to where males were getting more of the resource that they needed to achieve that degree. So, and that's a program that's still going that I'm very proud of today on that campus. So that was my first step into leadership, being a founder of this organization. And I saw the effects that it had on the campus and how it became a recruitment and retention strategy for the campus as well. So when I transferred to CSUSB, that was my mission: recruitment and retention for minority males. And when I got to CSUSB, I believe at the time, the African American population on our campus was about 5%. So I took on personally the responsibility to see that we increase that rate throughout my time on this campus. So if you do any background on Marlo Brooks, you will see a lot of recruitment and retention things come into light, and which speaks of how we got involved into politics. So um, what it means to be civically engaged. We had a district attorney running for office, which is a very prominent position in your city and state. And we wanted to know what this new district attorney felt that he could do better than the old one. If he's running, what would he do better for the community and better for the people of this community and of this state? And how would that look? So we invited him to our campus for a community talk. And I led that patch along with my organization on campus, the Student African American Brotherhood. And we led that conversation. And following that conversation, I received a phone call the following week from a political organization called Color of Change, which is aimed at getting youth, getting our youth into activism and becoming organizers. So when I received that phone call, their main question was, "Have I ever thought about running for politics?" And I always told them, I told them in that conversation that no, politics was never in my dream. Education is. I just wanted to see our youth get the proper education and get those degrees and go out here and our motto for Cal State is "We define the future." So if that's true, which is one that I truly believe in, if that's true, then we have to make the most of our education while we are in it today. So it's not just about going to school, going to class, and obtaining that degree, but the things that we actually do on the campus and in our communities because we should be practicing our degrees before we get them. We should be practicing those careers that we're following. So in that conversation, the person said that you'll be surprised how politics and education go hand in hand. So always the one for a challenge. Tell me more was my answer. And from there, we spent the next year and a half building me as a political figure. And I spent that time just getting more entrenched into our community, learning more of the different organizations that represent these communities, from housing authorities, from housing associations neighborhood associations, I'm sorry, to just everything from the NAACP to everything. I just felt the need to be involved, not as a political figure, but just as a resident of the community. So when it came time to announce, I was ready. I was a senior, which we saw, we saw all the things. It's close to me graduating. We don't want anything to get in the way. But I assured all my mentors and everyone that this has to happen now. The time is now. And I say that a lot. The time is now to everyone that I'm around, because when we look at our past leaders, our Martin Luthers and our Malcolms, they were young, changing political climates, for us all. And when I say it's you know, it's the time has passed for us to be sleeping on the job. We have to become active, and that doesn't mean running for office, or it literally just means sharing your knowledge, sharing your expertise with the ones that you're closely surrounded with. And I'm just happy to be closely surrounded by students daily, that I take under my wing and just practice the facet of protecting and sharing knowledge and sharing resources and really seeing each other evolve. And that's what it is. As a youthful person, you're evolving daily, yearly. So with that degree, you never go into college, you never come out of college the way you went in. You know, you're a different person on the other end of that degree. So it came time to announce that that I was running for city council, and I was just supported with this wave of, wow, this young man is actually stepping up to the challenge. And my biggest takeaway from running for office was to get others to see that, you know, you don't have to be a special person. You don't take a special degree to run for office or anything like that. It literally takes you going downtown, signing some papers, and saying that you want to represent your community. You've heard the outcries, you heard what's needed in your community, you see what's being presented to your community, you feel like you could do better, you can make change, or you can represent your community better than what's being presented to yourself. So, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to answer that call to service. And along the way, I met great people, and one of them are our panelists that you'll hear from later in the show, Chache Wright, which is the president of our local chapter, NAACP, who was born and raised San Bernardino, and you'll get to hear his great story of how he went off to college, came back, and really got entrenched into his community as well. You'll hear that story from him later on in the segment. But I really just wanted to talk about just being youthful and getting involved. When we hear the word civic engagement, a lot of times we turn our ears off if we're not practicing it, if we don't know exactly what that means. Civic engagement can simply be taking up that responsibility to make sure that you're representing yourself to the people, because we're being watched daily. So you're representing yourself to your peers, to your family, to your community as a leader, as someone who cares for our community, someone who shares the outcries, someone who shares, you know, what it means to be from this community and not get the service that we need. So take on the challenge, you know, take on the challenge within your family, take on the challenge within your peers. Earlier in the segment, it was talking about white people not feeling adequate enough to represent BLM, you know, and things like that. But it's not that. It's not inadequacy that's the problem. It's when you say that Black Lives Matter, but then you go back and your friends are, you know, still, your white peers are still, and there's a fear in that. There's a fear that, you know, you don't want to be outed within your friends. You know, you don't want to be on the outs with them, so you don't speak up when they say things that are out of pocket, or their beliefs aren't shared and their desires aren't shared. But are they really friends that you really want at the end of the day? Are they really people you see yourself growing with at the end of the day, if they truly don't see freedom, see equality the same as you? So a lot of times that's what stepping up is. That's what stepping up is separating yourself from that facet and really entrenching yourself in what's going on today. And equality is at our number one peak. It's always been, you know. So let's continue to practice that. I did want to share just um, my trench on running for office, being a student, being young, and there we have it. We'll have more time to answer questions towards the end of the show. So at this time, I want to introduce our next guest, which is a previous guest we had on our show. Did so well. We really want to bring her back. We have Dr. Elsa Valdez, which is a professor of sociology here at CSUSB, and we're going to bring her in with her next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlo.
No problem.
I'm going to talk about, you know, what in the Latino community we call La Migra, the Border Patrol. And I want to make some connections in terms of how does this relate to the Black Lives Matters movement. I think it was Diana who a little earlier talked about equality has to do with human rights, regardless of what community you come from. And I think many of our leaders forget that notion that, all groups, regardless of their background, have a right to be treated humanely. And so the connection that I'm going to make with Black Lives Matters movement is that La Migra, or the Border Patrol, has had a historical legacy in this society in terms of being a very oppressive and brutal agency of federal law enforcement. They also have engaged and are currently engaging in racial profiling. For example, in Arizona, you can look reasonably suspicious and be pulled over and be asked to provide evidence that you have a right to be here in this country. So if you happen to be brown looking, even though you're just driving through Arizona, you can legally be pulled over. Racial profiling in full force. Also, this branch of the federal government engages in surveillance and enforcement of people of color. It also has a long history of having white supremacists and also KKK people that actually have worked and even to this day continue to work with this branch of government, because it involves going after individuals that are defined as the other, which is similar to what has been done to many other groups. Also, there's a lot of invisibility up until the recent cases that we've all been involved in. A lot of the deaths that have occurred historically within the Black community have often been thrown under the carpet, and many of us have not until recently found out about other cases that also involved excessive use and the death of Black Americans who previously had been their families had been told that given another reason for why these individuals died. So that invisibility is also part of this conversation that we're engaging in this afternoon. And so the historical foundation of this country, unfortunately, is based on white supremacy, beginning with the removal of the indigenous from this country, the genocide of the different nations in this country, and continues today, were it not for the recent, the past and also recent groups that have spoken out. And I think it was Diana that also mentioned the racial alliances that have formed, I think, are very valuable in addressing any issue related to human rights. And so if you go back to the Mexican-American War, again, a lot of similarities with how African-Americans have been demonized in the society. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, resulted in racialization and vilification of people of Mexican descent. Mexico was lost, the vast part of the Southwest. The US bought it pretty much for $15 million around there. And so the border became militarized as early as, the late 1800s. And so Mexicans that were in the side of the US were given the choice of staying in the conquered land or going back to Mexico. The ones that decided to stay actually became second-class citizens. And then also a lot of those Mexican families that had properties that dated back to, several generations through devious practices by white entrepreneurs lost those territories, and those territories were never regained. And so then back in 1924, they came up with something, the government came up with the Immigration Act, which was implemented. And they actually didn't include Mexican immigrants. It was an effort to stop Asian immigration and also immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, because those were not the white Protestants that America wanted to incorporate into the country. So you had people from Poland, Greece, Italy, for example, that were coming to this country. So the alarm went off and they came up with this Immigration Act. Now, the problem is that the agricultural industry needed cheap labor forces. So they put pressure on the government not to include Mexican immigration in this act. And so you had the continual flow of Mexican families going back and forth between the border, going from Texas all the way to California. Now, the other connection that this law enforcement agency has with what's going on even today is that there were a lot of concern regarding what the mongrelization of the United States. That's been part of the history of this country. If you have brown or black or people that don't fit in, Chinese, other Asian Americans, we're going to mongrelize this country, and so we have to do something about it. So you've had all of these different laws that have been implemented historically to make sure that the race remained as pure as possible, which of course hasn't worked because, if you look at how diverse our country is, it's going to become even more diverse because we have more and more biracial, multiracial individuals in this country. And so the white America that people like Trump and other groups are hoping to get back to, it's not going to happen. It's a done deal, folks. That is not going to happen. And so we have to deal with it. And unfortunately, it has been dealt in a very unfair and unequal way. Then we had the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, something called the Mexican repatriation, where it's estimated between 400,000 to almost 1 million Mexicans, about 60% of them were actually citizens that were born here. They were deported back to Mexico, which is actually a violation of their civil rights. Now, during this time, you also have the Texas Rangers. Now, they were developed around, or they came around 1823 or so. But in Texas, this policing agency was given freedom to do whatever they wanted. And so you had a lot of Mexicans that were crossing the border that were beat, shot, and also hung, because they were not supposed to be here. We come up to 1942, World War II. They came up with something called the Bracero program. And so again, there was a shortage of labor, so Mexican labor was welcome to this country. And now, every time we have had these labor shortages, the other thing that happens is that, we have certain images that are portrayed that divide and conquer our nation, so that even today you hear a lot of, ideas about, well, these immigrants are taking away jobs from the real Americans. The fact is that it has to do with other factors in terms of the kinds of jobs that are available to many Americans or not available. But that's, another topic that a lot of research has been done on that topic. So by the 1970s, then, again, the United States felt that immigration was out of control. They came up with some other immigration restrictions. You started to see also a lot of journalists that started to investigate a lot of the atrocities that were going on within the border, 2,000-mile border. And so what border agents started to do at that point is that they started to go after, if you had families crossing over, they would target the children so that way the parents would then, give themselves up, and they didn't want to be separated from the children. And so then that started to be a very useful tactic. And even though it was a cruel practice, which is also something that happened just recently, what we see is that this isn't the first time that when Trump started to separate children from their parents and started putting them in concentration camps. This has happened before. This isn't anything new that immigrants have dealt with. But the 1990s, and you had more programs that were implemented to tighten the border. They actually started to build the wall that you see going on even today, so that immigrants were then having to go further and further into the desert, which resulted in hundreds of deaths because they were crossing mountains and deserts. And in many cases, you had children, whole families that were crossing. And so in terms of, what's going on today, then again, I would argue that there's a lot of connections. The 9/11, you had Homeland Security, which was a combination of 20 agencies of the federal government. And the idea was that we don't want any terrorists coming over the border. Well, the fact is that there has never been one terrorist that's been caught coming over the border to come over here and do damage to this country. You don't see the same kind of vigilant monitoring going on in the Canadian border. And again, you know, this kind of approach has resulted in a lot of immigrants and families being deported back, but it hasn't solved the issue of what do we do with 12 million or so immigrants that we have in this country. And so the Homeland Security, also the ICE, as we refer to it, and you know, it replaces La Mira. They've also been involved in a lot of situations that we may not hear about because they're not reporting, you know, this information out. So you've had, you know, some children that have died while in the custody of the Border Patrol. You've seen Trump coming out recently on television bragging about how he's still building the border. And of course, initially Mexico was supposed to pay for it, which never happened. So again, if you look at the long history of this country, what we're seeing is that we've gone into what's called a moral abyss, not just among, you know, Latinos, but also as evidenced by the hundreds of deaths of African Americans, many of whom we will never know what actually happened to them. And, you know, if we are to, you know, actually look at, you know, what are the factors behind, you know, why all of this is going on. Of course, a lot of it has to do with socioeconomic status. Marlo, you were talking earlier about, you know, your desire to be involved in politics because that's where a lot of the decisions that affect our communities are made. But the problem is that for many, you know, people of color such as ourselves, it takes a lot of money to run a campaign, to get your message out there. You can do a lot of grassroots, but you still need money to be able to, you know, get the word out to the communities in terms of what you have to offer and what you're going to do to make the community a lot better. And so I would really encourage you, as well as some of the other young people that are here today this afternoon, to get involved in voter registration, to get involved in, you know, running for politics. If you look at recent decisions made by our own Board of Supervisors here in this county, they have a phenomenal budget. And with that budget, they decide which communities get what kind of funding. And so those are very important political offices. So that start at the city council and work your way into the county board of supervisors, the assembly, the Senate, the Congress. You know, we need to start getting and training and working with our young people to run for those offices so that better decisions that affect our community can start emerging. And so I'm really happy to see the many faces that are on this program on a weekly basis that are interested in addressing human rights issues. And so that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Valdez. And again, thank you for returning as a panelist on the show and giving that historical background, that historical context in the Mexican-American culture. And we're just happy to have you back. I enjoyed you the first time, yes.
I hope I was able to illustrate the connections that all of the groups in our country have in terms of human rights and making sure that, you know, their voices are heard. And when you look at the protesters that were out on the streets demanding justice for George Floyd, as well as some of the other African Americans, there were a lot of Latinos that were there side by side with our African American brothers and sisters. You know, we feel very passionate about making sure that human rights are given to all of our African American communities. And so the only way that's going to happen is, again, if we continue to have these conversations that we're having today, as well as getting our students involved. And so one of the toughest jobs for some of the professors like myself, as well as the ones that are on the panel, is getting our students to think about getting involved in different organizations. A lot of it has to do because we have a lot of commuter students. A lot of them have families. Some of them work 2 jobs. It's not always easy to do other kinds of activities. But, you know, it just takes a few young people like yourselves to, you know, go out there and recruit and get something going so that, you know, we can have like Chache's and, you know, involved with the NAACP, the rest of you that are in different groups. And Marlo, when you run for office, there's no shame in asking people to contribute to your campaign. And that's one of the things that I think is very difficult for us when we start running for any kind of office. You know, knocking on doors or calling people or sending them emails and asking, you know, for people like us to help you get elected is something that you really want to take seriously, because I'd like to see you, whether it's city council or school board or any other political position, I would love to see you elected to one of those
Thank you.
positions, and I will fully support you 100%.
Thank you so much. I have a lot of fight left in me, so you will see me. Thank you. That was my biggest struggle too, is the financial side of running for office. Asking for money was the hardest thing I ever had to do because I was raised that a man, you know, doesn't have his hand out. A man works for what he wants. So that was the biggest struggle in campaigning, was asking people for money. I'd rather fund my project myself, but it was a great learning experience, and I can't wait to run again for whatever my next calling is. So
Wonderful.
thank you. I do want to remind everyone listening that we do have a Q&A button at the bottom of our screens there. If you have any questions, and it doesn't have to be exactly on anything that the panelists have presented so far today, you can just have a question that's maybe been circling around in your head or you don't know how to ask. Remember, this is a safe space, and we are here to answer any questions that you may have for your community, within your family, or what's the next steps involved in where we go from here. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our co-host, Kameron Pyant, who will be introducing our final panelists.
Yeah. Appreciate it, Marlo. Also, thank you, Dr. Valdez, for all the, you know, the abundance of information that you have given us. It's really interesting in terms of like what our leaders find important to, you know, instill into this world, because it's like we already know what they have continue to uphold, like within this world and within this nation. We've all have been talking about it this whole time. It's like nothing that we're like how you were saying, Dr. Valdez. It's like it's a moral abyss. Like there is nothing there is nothing morally correct about this world at all. Like everything is so backwards, and like I don't know. It's kind of hard to, you know, flip that so quick. But I feel like we've been making a lot of different progress on everything, but I don't even want to take as much time. I like to hear what our next panelists have to say. So I would like to take this time to introduce the president of the NAACP on the San Bernardino branch, Chache Wright.
All right. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chache Wright. I am the president of the San Bernardino branch for NAACP. I won't belabor you all with the drawn out dialogue or, you know, monologue about me or anything like that. But just briefly, as Marlo mentioned, I am from the Inland Empire. I was born in Fontana, raised in Rialto, and honed by San Bernardino. I still attend my home church, New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, that I was pretty much born and raised in, which also happens to be the church that our branch was founded in. And as he stated, I attended school at Rialto High School. And once I graduated, I genuinely had the belief that I was never coming back to the IE. I went to attend school at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And I had a great time there. I loved every aspect of it. And more often than not, people would ask me what it was like, and I always tell them it just reminded me a lot of San Bernardino, just a lot more to do. Upon receiving my acceptance letter to Morehouse, I also got a notification that I was going to be a father. So I was also a father going through trying to graduate and trying to finish my education or complete my education. all throughout the time. So as a result, God works in mysterious ways, and the universe lines you up in certain ways that it's just designed for you to be where you're supposed to be. I often came home. In fact, I never missed a birthday, never missed, every summer I was home, never missed a Christmas. I was always coming back home to be with my oldest child. And in that process, I would always have these, I was always rooted in community service. There's just something that is just drilled in me. My mother was an activist, and she's heavily involved in the community. In fact, she's actually the secretary of our branch, and it's kind of hard to be a leader and also have to take dictatorship from from your mother at the same time. However, I always was involved in community activity, no matter where I lived, and it really waned on my heart when I would come home, and I knew that I was doing some impactful things in other communities, and I saw things that were needed in my own community. And I about 5 years ago, pretty much made the commitment that I would come back, and I, of course, wouldn't come back and be quiet or silent and just sit back and not do anything. And so immediately I hit the ground running. I was already involved in the active member of the NAACP in other locations, even on Morehouse campus. And so when I came back home, I just kind of really wanted to take a back seat. And like Marlo, I was a little reluctant on any opportunity of leadership or stepping into the role or the obligation to do anything in the capacity of leadership. I just wanted to do the work. I'm still very, our previous president, John Fudge, rest in peace, rest in power. He perished passed due to cancer complications in October. I was the second vice president, and then that mantle fell to me. Now, I wasn't necessarily enthused about it, but I'm also not a man that shies away from French or obstacles. I definitely felt that it was just, the opportunity for me to active and be a man of my word and say that I'm really committed to doing whatever it takes or doing what is necessary for my community. And so I accepted the role. In the process, it's been a bit of a challenge in the sense that I'm not that young, but I'm also not that old, and there is a lot of balancing act with respect to the role that I'm in. And it also just kind of makes me feel as though, again, I'm aligned in terms of my role, simply because this is essentially how the organization was founded. It's a biracial organization that started in 1909. And when they originally started, they particularly had to be strategic in the way that they approach things, because there are a multitude of agendas that everyone has a different perspective on how it is that things should be executed. Even to this day, within our own organization, there are different perspectives on how we should execute and how we should move about. But the power in our organization is not simply just in our title, even though it does have a little bit of weight to it. It's also in the structure of the organization. And as Dr. Polletta had mentioned, with the power operating from bottom up instead of top down, it makes it a lot stronger and more impactful in terms of where we strike. And just to give you an idea on what that approach is like, everyone is pretty much familiar with the Rosa Parks story. But what not most people are familiar with is actually the Claudette Colvin's story. So Claudette was actually the Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks, where she actually genuinely sat down. She did not want to give up her seat. But because of her social status and her reputation, she was a young lady. She was also a young mother. And that didn't, according to the social standards at that time, look favorably for the argument that she was just doing what she had to do, or she was just exercising her own human right. So what they strategically did was they approached Rosa Parks, who is a very seemingly nice woman, and they told her strategically, this is what you have to do, and this is how you have to say it. And when she was arrested, that began to actually show and bring to surface the importance of equality and how there is an injustice. And I think, in my personal opinion, I believe that it actually happened on both sides of not only the Black community or people of color, but also for the white community in terms of, well, I never saw it that way, or I never even realized that I have a certain perspective about what's happening today. And I think that would have the same notion to, I was watching a clip earlier today with Candace Owens, and a lot of people don't necessarily feel highly favorable about her, but she was actually interviewing Mark Lamont, and it was an excellent dialogue. I actually encourage anyone who has an opportunity to watch it to do so. But what was stated in the conversation was that on both sides of the situation, unanimously, they, from no matter what your background is, unless you're an extremist, more often than not, most people have the consensus that what happened that day was wrong. What occurred to that man, no matter what you believe about his social background or his character or anything, that shouldn't have happened. And I believe that that's one of the key reasons in which we have to have that solidarity. I see a lot of organizations and a lot of opportunities. And like Dr. Polletta said, there are many organizations, even in this community, that have been doing the work. And so when I came into my leadership role, that was one of my, you know, I'm from this community and I was born and raised here. I knew that there were already people, while I was away, had been instituting the groundwork and putting down the hard, boots to ground labor to make change or impact change. And so it has been my fervent effort and my strongest goal. I've said this often, if I don't accomplish anything in this leadership role, it will only to be that I have built and forged and developed stronger bonds with the NAACP of this branch, with our fellow organizations throughout the community. And I've had a lot of success with that. And then, in fact, that's exactly how Marlo and I kind of crossed paths. We kind of were just, both moving and shaking and trying to, get where we can get. And I kept running into him, and I just finally just stopped and was like, brother, I keep seeing you everywhere. And we just had a dialogue, and instantly we knew that, we had a common goal. We had a common vision with respect to what it is that we hope and desire to see in our community. And so I have always been very adamant about trying to be an example, as was stated earlier, that you can't just talk about it, you have to be about it. And so whenever there's an opportunity for me to sign up, even if it's just me, I'm gonna come over there, I'm gonna roll up my sleeves. And it's been a very challenging journey, and it's also been an exciting journey because I see the young people coming out and I see the way that they're impacting change. And I just think that it's an amazing time to be alive, because we're actually on the cusp of a paradigm shift. And I always tell people this, that like what's happened today is the older people are upset today because of what they've seen in the past. But ultimately, we're fighting for what we expect to see tomorrow, which is ultimately and essentially the young people tomorrow. And so that's why I feel that it's imperative that right now, the young people, now that we're still in this, and I'm not even just saying this specifically with getting involved with the NAACP, because that's also a key component about the civil rights movement altogether. I mean, even when Dr. King was teaching teaching peace, all throughout the country, there were still moments of chaos that literally woke people up, like the Watts riots in 1965. And so we kind of have to be cognizant of the fact that we don't want to necessarily be destructive, but sometimes there is a lane or there is a place for you in terms of how you want to exhibit or how you want to release that rage or that angst. I will be the first to tell you that the NAACP is not necessarily that organization in terms of we're being violent or destructive in any capacity whatsoever. But I understand it, and in that understanding, I would encourage everyone, if you choose to get involved with the an organization like the NAACP, that your methods and your approach to things requires a strategic approach, and that's what our organization is founded in. That's what our organization has been about for the well over 100 years of service that we've always instituted. I mean, even in the San Bernardino community itself, we were an integral part of, in 1972, the desegregation of schools in the San Bernardino Unified School District. And so there are always going to be things that we need to address. Racism isn't going anywhere, or anytime soon, understanding that, as Marlo said, it's taught, and you have to unlearn to relearn the way to approach things. So you can't always attack everything. It can't always be fire for fire. And it's always an opportunity for growth, and that's what I love about these dialogues and these sessions. Lastly, I just want to say that in the recent activities, I've been in contact and a strong dialogue with law enforcement all throughout our communities. Literally, as I was swiping the screen, one of the chief of, not the chief, but the deputy chief of police for San Bernardino was asking when we were going to schedule our next meeting. I also have a meeting with the chief of police for Ontario. I've been meeting with the police of Rialto and Redlands. And in each scenario, there has not been a conversation that was had where it was just absolute, a standoff, or we weren't seeing eye to eye at all. In fact, I would say the converse. There was always, every scenario was a constructive dialogue, and they understood the need of change and hearing out the community, and they actually were eager to hear out the community, and data that somehow imply or try to support the notion that Black people aren't being, or people of color aren't being affected police by law enforcement disproportionately. I think we need to take into consideration that that's just what's on the books, and we have to recognize that what happened with George Floyd is just an incident that happened on camera, and that these type of situations happen all across America, and there's nobody taking film, there's nobody there to tell the story, there's nobody there to back it up, and that's why we have to stay in the fight and have to be aggressive about how we move and when we move, and not to just simply be reactive, but to be proactive. And that's pretty much my take on it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Chache. Wow, man, it's a lot to unpack there, and I know we're going to get to that in just a second. I did want to just, tell you thank you. Exactly like you said, we crossed paths with the same vision. One of the things that you said, and I deeply agree with. It was a part of my thought process every day as I was running for office was, how do I continue to push, the objectives of our community figures and community leaders and the history of our city? How do I continue to push that every day? Because there's way many people before me that has carried this torch, and not just running for office, but just being leaders in their community and in their household. And how do I continue to make them proud? And that was a big part of running as well. When you mentioned former president, past president John Fudge, he was a great inspiration of me running. He's also one of our founders of our multicultural division on our campus at CSUSB, our multicultural center, cross-cultural center that we have in our student union on campus, which I and myself, I and Kameron both work at, myself and Kameron both work at as student assistants, where we practice that daily diversity and inclusion, and just to know the importance of others' backgrounds and their history, because we're so similar, you know, to a lot of the microaggressions that's gone on in the history of America. So to bring that awareness of different cultures and backgrounds and put them all together just so that we can get that understanding. Another portion that I push a lot as a student assistant working in the cross-cultural center is talking about, you know, when you get out there, when you obtain that degree and you get out there in your career field, you're not just going to be working with people that look just like you know? So here's that time to practice that diversity and inclusion here on the campus. And I think that's just an important factor to have on every college campus, is to increase the awareness of different backgrounds and ethnicities. So thank you so much for those words. We're gonna go straight into our Q&A because we have about 30 minutes left on the show. And because it's so much dialogue that we want to have with you different panelists today. So we're gonna jump right into it. And Chache, me knowing you personally, I wanted to ask you, how important do you think it is? Because not only are you, so we have many first generation college students, but we have a lot of first generation activists. I myself included in that as well. But you have been surrounded by people, you know, entrenched in the communities growing up. Your mother, which you said earlier, is now the secretary of your branch of the NAACP, but also a huge part of my campaign was consulting with your sister. A lot of people who may be in this room don't know, you have a sister named Chache Wright, who consults on politics in the Empire on different campaigns, and she was a huge part of building strategy and just talking about, you know, this is my first time out there, so she was just giving me trillions of ideas and just things that we can approach. But how important you think that is to have that type of, you know, if you could see it, you can achieve it, and you've always been surrounded by it. I'm sure it affected, you know, your vision of, man, I got to get out there in my community, you know, I'm next. But I myself, as a first generation, you know, I truly hope that I inspire others to do the same. So how important you think that facet of it is for the people who are looking to get involved in their communities and don't really know how and things like that. But how important you think it is, just because, you know, no one's beside you is doing it, that don't mean you shouldn't miss your chance to step up to the plate as well.
So if I were to extend any encouragement or notions of suggestion with respect to that, as a first generation activist, I think one of the key things to keep in perspective is that that if you're genuinely passionate about it, if it's something that specifically moves you in your spirit and your heart, that you have to be committed to the fight for it. It's not always going to be easy. In fact, it's actually not supposed to be. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an issue that you would be having to take a stance against. However, if you are to take that stance, just know that you have to be confident enough to know that what you're doing is right. And then also be humble enough to hear when someone's giving you proper suggestion on a way to approach you. Unfortunately, in this endeavor or this initiative, I've seen a lot of times and where I've seen people who have been very vocal and very, outspoken and just literally trailblazers. They run into obstacles that they don't necessarily have to run into simply because it's rooted in the notion of, I have to do it my own way. I think that it might be prudent and just wise to not try to reinvent the wheel on a lot of initiatives and endeavors. That's something that my sister and I kind of really operate in tandem with, and we really, build each other. Sometimes I'm very like, I just want to do it this way. She's like, go, 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 go. And I'm like, I have to tell her, listen, we have to slow down just for a second, just to try to approach it from a different angle. She's like, I don't want to hear nobody else's angles. And it's a give and take. But in making the effort, I saw a question that popped up. I don't know if that was for me, but it's always important to not just think that you're alone but also not to think your vision or your intent on the situation is all that matters. If you're going to be about the community, make certain that you're doing it for the community and not yourself. And try to remind, I do that constantly. I wake up every morning and I try to make sure, and I try to repeat to myself as a mantra, like, let this work be about my community and not about me. And whenever I feel that it's getting about me, because, you know, certain things will really rile you up. People will push your buttons, and things will happen that will really kind of touch your spirit, and you will want to go full-fledged on just whatever you're feeling at the moment. But you have to remember what's best with your actions, what you're doing it for, what's the purpose. And that's what I would really encourage and suggest in anyone. Not even just if it's your first time. I don't care if you're a vet. You know, you got to remind yourself that it's not about you.
Thank you so much for that question, Marlo, and thank you, Chache, for really going into detail. We have a question here from the audience for Professor Valdez. They say, hello, Professor. I recently read an article that said Trump's approval rating among Latinos, Hispanics has actually gone up. If this is actually true, can you explain why? Professor?
Professor, you're muted right now. There you go.
Okay, well, one explanation that I've, thought about, because I had relatives that actually voted for him when he first ran. And it wasn't that they liked him personally, but because of his position on abortion, because many of my own family, as well as a large percent of the Latino population, are Catholics, and they're pro-life. And so that's been a big issue in the community, especially depending on your socioeconomic status. For many Latinos, that's a really tough issue because they believe in, human rights for everyone. And so sometimes their religious beliefs leads them to vote for a candidate, even though they may not necessarily like that person, in terms of what their other beliefs are. But I, hope that this time around, come November, that even some of my relatives who are Catholic that voted for him because they are pro-life will think about some of the other damage that this man is doing to this country. The moral abyss that I spoke about earlier is being led by this man to the tune of over 130,000 people have died from this virus, and most of them are Latinos, African Americans, low-income individuals. We've had 2 family members that we've lost from the virus, and so this has hit really close to home. And also in terms of Latinos, remember that they're very diverse. Cuban Americans tend to be more likely to be Republican, and so they do vote Republican, and they were a large voting bloc in Florida and a couple of other states for the last election. And so California, of course, is very different. You have, I think, Latinos this time around are going to be less likely to vote for him, especially with the immigration issues that are going on. And so again, we do have a portion of the Latino community that is conservative, that are Republicans, but I wouldn't say that they represent the majority of Latinos. I think even the pro-lifers, and I know even in my community and my family, and trying to, talk to them about some of the things they want to think about, when they go to go do their absentee voting, think about the damage that this is doing, just in terms of the losses that we've had in our family. With the coronavirus hitting mostly communities of color. I just saw him interviewed, this was a couple days ago, and he turned to Pence and he said, oh, how many people have we lost? About 130,000. Oh, we're not doing that bad. Well, yes, we are, because most of those people that died happened to be Latinos and African Americans. It's not his family that's dying off, it's our communities. And I feel very passionate about the fact that, we need to get somebody in there that's gonna keep us from dying out slowly. People of my age, and it's not even people that are my age, it's also young people that are now dying. And if, people are considering voting for them, they need to think about how close it's gonna hit them, when their relative or their loved one dies. when somebody has to die in the hospital by themselves without any family members, that's when they're also going to feel as passionate as I do about what's going on in this society. And, you know, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, some of those Republican representatives have refused to embrace the movement. They have refused to even say the names, such as Vice President Pence. When he was interviewed and asked about whether he supported or embraced this movement, he absolutely refused to even make a comment on that. So those are the things that people have to look at. And again, in our Latino community, because of its diversity, the numbers that are going up, I believe, represent a lot of the more conservative Republicans that are within our community. And most of those folks are, you know, from the Cuban community. We have some Latinos, especially that business owners and other entrepreneurs, and social class has a lot to do with it. So I hope that number does turn around, and I hope that the majority of Latinos, which are becoming a large voting bloc, I hope that they, you know, think about who it is they're truly wanting to put into office. Do they want to keep going further into a moral abyss, or do they want to take us out of this terrible time that we're dealing with right now? Thank you.
Also, I just want to chime in really quickly. I would be remiss not to emphasize the importance of registering and voting. If you are not registered, please reach out to me. I put my information on the in the chat. I will get you set up. I will have somebody come over and register you personally if we got to. But as Dr. Valdez stated, that we cannot simply just assume that things will just work themselves out if we don't actually get out there and let our voices be heard through the ballot. That's also a strong initiative that our organization and our branch are pushing. So if you want to get registered, or if you want to just even try to help with getting others registered, we'd love to have your support and your assistance and resources and whatever you want to do to get involved in that movement in terms of getting some change in that era. Please, I can't stress enough. You can think that it don't matter if you want to, but then you're going to be the same person that has to look around your surroundings and see that it's not the way you want it to be, and you have no one but yourself to blame.
Yeah.
I had a question for our panelists. I believe Dr. Johnson and Dr. Polletta mentioned briefly periods in between climates of activism and transitions into conservative climates. What comes to mind is Wilmington, which in history kind of signified a point where we really push for even further segregation because of the violence that came from the Wilmington riots. I want to know if from your research, backlashes like these are a pattern, and should we be expecting a backlash now, a conservative backlash now, after the progress that we've made with protests? If either of you would like to comment. Oh, Dr. Johnson, I believe you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I consistently, think about and teach about backlash politics, so exactly what you're discussing. And yeah, if we look throughout American history, that's kind of the ebbs and flows or waves of racial progress. So if we think about, all the way back to post-Civil War, and then the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment that comes out after emancipation, then we have a major backlash, right? We have incredible amounts of lynching and racial violence. And we see these over and over again, backlashes to, of course, civil rights happening with the rise of Nixon and, his kind of law and order mantra, and then Reagan and his racially coded but very racist language, but he uses different words, like says, for instance, you're going to have the right to decide that you're going to that someone of color can't buy your house, or you have the quote unquote right to choose if your child goes to a school that's integrated. So it's actually co-opting that language from civil rights movements and kind of twisting it, because that's part of this kind of new post-civil rights backlash. era. So yeah, unfortunately, we see that time and time again. And then a lot of scholars write about how President Trump is a backlash to the election of President Obama. So I definitely see how we could be situated. However, I would say right now, I mean, although we have these really impressive, powerful movements, I would say, and still kind of teach this, that we're actually still very much in like a much this kind of Reagan era post-civil rights backlash, like neoliberal, neoconservative. We're actually very much still there. I think we're very much in that space. So I'm hoping that the fact that then we're seeing this is hopefully a really long period, it's the beginning of a very long period of resistance to so many decades of now, I think, racial discrimination, rising racial and economic inequality. So that's kind of my initial take on the question. I think it's a really good thing to think about.
Thank you so much. Would you like to
Yeah,
contribute?
can I jump in? I also think it's a great question. And I agree with Diana. So yes, there will be a backlash. But if you go back to the 1960s, what's interesting is that it took 10 years after Nixon started talking about law and order for the government to actually pass conservative policies. So I think the key here is going back to electoral power, gaining offices, gaining political power, that if progressives can gain political power, even if there's a conservative backlash, it will take some time for them to be able to do anything with it. And so I just want to reiterate the importance and how glad I am that we're talking about protest and politics on the same panel, because I think sometimes we tend to see those two as separated, and there are people who say, I'm protesting, I don't care about which party wins, but I think it really, really matters. And so I'm so glad that people like Marlo are running for office, because it's sending a message to people not only that they can participate in politics, but that who you elect, not only president, but who you elect at the state and local level really, really matters and can have lasting effect, even if a backlash sets in.
I think to add to that, my colleague, Elsa Valdez, is being very humble and not identifying herself as a former school board member. And I think her experience is a lesson in if you run for local office, or any office for that matter, you're going to get a lot of punches. And I think she, and I don't want to speak for you also, so maybe you can say a little bit about it, but I witnessed her, trying so hard to reform the school, to fight the unions. Not all unions are good. And I'm not saying the teachers' unions are bad, because I'm a part of 2 teachers' unions, but sometimes, they prevent progress. So Elsa, would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Absolutely. When you run for office, you are going to be under the microscope constantly. And so, you have to develop a very thick skin, but, keeping your eye on the prize and always remembering, why it is you ran for office. And that is for me, it was, local politics is very important, because, we're the ones that decide where the budget's going to be spent, what kinds of services are we going to give our students, what kinds of teachers are we going to hire, to teach our kids in the school district. But with that comes, also, as Mary said, a lot of punches. And, a lot of times you just have to let it slide off your back. And, because you do have to work with a variety of groups. And as Mary said, unions, we're part of a union as faculty. And that's the reason I came to the Cal State system, was because we had a union. When you're a professor of color, and Mary and I have had this conversation in the over, almost 30 years that we've known each other, were it not for the union, we might not be here as full professors today. You know, they have been very helpful in making sure that we were able to keep our jobs and move through the process. But at the same time, what I have found also is that sometimes unions protect, just as you see with policing, they protect the bad apples. And so this is why we need, you know, new laws so that we can make sure those bad apples are not protected and that they are not policing our communities, whether it's, you know, in our local cities, or even we had a conversation last time, a couple sessions ago, about the value of policing on school campuses. And my position is that we should use that money to put it back into the classroom for the services that our students need, and come up with a different process of making sure that the schools are safe. And so it does take, you know, a lot of collaboration. Sometimes it's difficult to get, you know, agreement on everything, but the main thing is, you know, you want to remember why you ran for that position in the first place. But you know, Marlo, you know, and I know you're going to run again, because you can't just, you know, sometimes it takes a few times. The second time, I think, you know, you're going to take what you've learned and you're going to use that, and you're going to have a very powerful campaign. Plus, again, you know, asking for people to help you, not just with, you know, putting signs in the yard, but getting them to, you know, whether it's $5 or $10, whatever they can afford. And as Francesca said, you know, politics and protests, those go hand in hand. And, you know, we need to continue to, again, support our local leaders and people like Marlo. I think I can just see you, you know, elected to one of the positions here locally. But, you know, it does take a tough skin. And being a professor, it gave me a good training in terms of being able to run for a political office, because what I found was that going through the process of getting tenured and promoted and becoming a full professor, that was an easy process, not an easy process. And so that actually prepared me very well for running for political office. And we have a lot of great organizations in our communities that can also be helpful for any, you know, especially our young people, because you still, you know, we need that energy that we've seen in the protests lately to go out there and make a difference for us. So, you know, I was on the board, you know, for over a decade, and it's something that, you know, was a real learning experience for me. But again, I always went back to the roots of, you know, why is it that I ran? And that always kept me stable, because I think sometimes if you let it get to your head, you know, you can start going in the wrong direction. So there's always something that happens in your life that brings you back to reality. Just when you think, well, I've made it now, I'm successful, something happens to remind you that no, you're just another person of color, and you need to remember that, because you're not better than anyone else. And so, you know, that my family, I think, is something that I've always valued very much, because that's what's kept my feet on the ground and from letting me take things too seriously. But at the same time, you know, those struggles that you go with, and sometimes you don't have anyone that you can talk to about what's going on internally, you know, can be very stressful. But at the end of the day, it was worth every battle that we had to fight, you know, to try and get better education for all of our students, because you don't represent just one group of students. But for me, I always felt a special affinity to what we consider our high-risk students, the ones that weren't straight A students. I was one of those students, didn't have parents that spoke English, struggled in school. And so a lot of our students that come from low-income backgrounds, that was something that I really fought for, to make sure that, you know, whatever I could bring to the table to make sure that those children also had the best chance they could to become successful in their education. And again, you know, didn't, you know, win everything along the way, but you just do the best you can. You know, that hard work does pay off.
Thank you, Dr. Valdez, and I want to commend you for serving in your capacity in over a decade and reminding us, of what motivates you to what motivated you to keep going year after year and serving, reminding yourself, what you got into this for and why you do this, and thank you for serving those underprivileged and our high risk students, and again to our first generation activists or people who just want to get out there, don't know how to start or where to start. Remind yourself why you're doing it, and that's what's gonna pull you in every day. That's what you're gonna wake up for. That's what's gonna keep a smile on your face. The same way how teachers teach for years. It's not a paycheck that keeps them coming back. It's the love for the education system and those children itself that keeps them coming back. So find that love in that. Make sure you remind yourself of that every day. Before we get out of here, Chache, I want to bring you back to the center stage because again, to our first generation activists out there or people who are looking to get involved. Could you briefly talk about how to possibly get involved with the NAACP branch of San Bernardino? I'm not sure if you have to be a resident of San Bernardino or a resident of the Inland Empire. If anyone's listening and would like to join, could you give a little information on that?
Sure. So first and foremost, to be a part of there are two ways you can be a member of the NAACP. You can be a member at large, or you can be a member of your local branch. Now, being a member of your local branch doesn't necessarily mean that you have to join San Bernardino if you, or you have to join San Bernardino if you live in San Bernardino. It's just probably the most logical opportunity for you to be effective in your own community. But we actually do have memberships of members who are in other states. Like my closest friend that I went to college with, he lives in Chicago, but he's a member of our branch. We also have a handful of members who have joined at large, which basically means you're a part of the national level of branching of membership, which only disadvantage of that is it doesn't give you the opportunity to be included in the voting process in terms of leadership. So if we were to have an election for a new president, as a member at large, you wouldn't be able to participate in our branch elections. To join, you can just simply go to our website, San Bernardino NAACP.org. I'll put that in the chat. And one of the first things on the top of the page, right next to a picture of Honorable John Futch, is join or donate. And for people who are, kind of reluctant, your thoughts are, I'm not a political person, or I don't really get involved in that. Your service and your resources are not just limited to that capacity of activism. There are several ways that you can be involved. You can be a person in the background, maybe just making calls, or maybe your gift is art, and you could be making signs for our protesters. There are so many ways that you can be involved in this fight, and you shouldn't. I would encourage you not to limit yourself or limit your perception on what it is that organizations do or what they do, and just focus on what it is that you do. Utilize that skill and that ability so that you can be making an impact in your community. Even if it's not with the NAACP, find someone or some way to use your gifts, use your talents, use your acumen, or whatever it is that you can adequately contribute, and just make an impact in your community. Again, that's going to be the website, San Bernardino NAACP.org. And actually, I'm sorry, San Bernardino NAACP.org/memberships. That will take you directly to the option to join or become a member.
Thank you so much. My co-host Yvette and Cameron, do you have any closing remarks for us today? And any panelists, if you would like to have any final remarks as well, you can too. We have about 4 minutes left in the show. Anything you think important for our community to know before we head out today?
I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. I'm really so grateful every week to be here and to hear just the wealth of knowledge that you all bring, and all the different perspectives that you all bring. So I really appreciate that. And also really quick, the story that we talked about, the Walking While Trans ban and having that repealed, I put the link to get involved with that in the chat. So go ahead and check that out.
Just want to thank you, Yvette. I wanted to just give a really, really brief synopsis of of a group that I was invited to several weeks ago in the town that I live in. This is a town that has had a cafe on our main boulevard, whose name spells out KKK. So it's not the most progressive place in the world. And there was a confrontation between some Latino young people, mostly men, across the street from that cafe a few weeks ago. And they were confronted by a group of armed white men, some of whom were very intoxicated. And it seems that the leaders in this particular town, I won't say my town, but this particular town, were very upset about that. It's like, you know, what's going on here? What do you mean? This can't happen in our sleepy little town, right? So they invited me and a couple of other people, African Americans, to talk to them. It was very secret, no recording devices. So that told me something right away, you know, that people are, and this really brought home, you know, Francesca's and Diana's talks about multiracial coalition. So I'm thinking, you know, I'm encouraged that for the first time in all the years I've been, in the decades I've been here, that this is happening in this town. But I get there and there are two police officers there, and who are, you know, they let them talk first, and they're talking about, you know, rescuing homeless people and rescuing cats in trees and all of that. So it became almost like a pep rally for cops. And so I saw where this was going. And it was actually a minister who started the discussion, and he, the first thing he said was, well, the first thing you Black people need to do is get rid of Shaun King. And some of us know who Shaun King is. You know, Shaun King is this online activist who called for, his latest thing was calling for getting rid of all the images of white Jesus. And so this minister was upset because Shaun King wants to get rid of white Jesus. And I pointed out to him, well, there's not one white person in the Bible. You know, everybody, all the people in the Bible were people of color, right? And so it just went downhill from there. You know, it was very discouraging that we were invited to this supposedly safe space, and then we were being preached to. We were being told what we should do. And I've had that experience before, but I thought maybe we progressed enough now where that won't happen again. So just be careful where you are invited, I guess. I said to them, you know, I can't help you all. You all have got to do the work. I gave them books, I gave them films, but it's not my responsibility to make white people not racist. You know, they have got to do the work themselves. And the response online, because, you know, we're on kind of a listserv, because I introduced myself as the stereotypical angry Black woman, and, you know, kind of being funny and, you know, trying to break the ice, but people took me seriously. And one woman, one Latina, as a matter of fact, who has 2 Black grandchildren, who's very concerned about them, she said she felt personally attacked. I don't know how that happened. She started the conversation about being personally attacked, and then, you know, everybody else chimed in. Yes, she's so angry. Why is she so angry? You know, so anyway, that's kind of my latest experience with you know, multiracial coalition. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about Francesca before we leave.
Oh God, I'm sorry you had to go through that. I mean, but that's the problem, right? I mean, in my predominantly white community, people loved going on marches and holding up their signs in their white community. But the question is, well, what do you do next? Mm-hmm. Right? And I thank you for this panel, because I think all of you were talking in different ways about what do we all do next. I'm struck by the fact that when I was teaching in the spring, so many students wrote to me and said, what should we do? Where do we go? And so I just want to say, if there are students watching this and want to get involved, that you can ask your sociology professors what to go do, where to go. You can go to your NAACP, you can go to students on campus. It is often challenging to figure out who to talk to get involved, but there really are ways to do so. And just to thank you again, all of you who are doing these conversations. It's so valuable, and I'm really grateful for having the chance to participate.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, that just about wraps us up. We thank you all. Our little baby has grown so much as we continue this series on conversations on race and policy throughout the weeks. I want to remind everyone to join us each and every Wednesday at 4 p.m. as we bring in new community leaders and just hear voices of our trying times that's going on right now and figure out what to do next. Let's see where we're headed as a nation and as a community, where we're going next, and if we could continue to ignite change and bring solutions to these problems, then that's what we're here for. That's how we serve every week. I'm just honored to be among my co-hosts, Yvette and Kameron. I just enjoy you guys each week, and our panelists come full and ready to indulge us in their expertise, and these learnings are just becoming great. So guys, we are signing off